Jim and I had just finished our day shift at the plant and were driving home together in my car. We always drove to work together when our shifts overlapped, and this week it was my turn to use the car. As soon as we left the plant, Jim asked me to stop at the pharmacy on the way home so he could fill his prescription. His wife, Sally, had a bad cold, and the doctor prescribed medicine to get rid of the stubborn cold. Since we were driving close to the pharmacy where my wife, Rachel, worked, I decided that I was going to surprise Jim, as well as my wife, and stop there. In all the years she worked there, I never visited her at work. In fact, I had never been to this pharmacy before, and I decided that she would be very surprised to see me there today. I never dared visit her at the pharmacy because I didn't want her coworkers or her boss to think I was checking on her. Surprisingly, she never commented on this fact to me. She was working today, and I knew she would be very surprised to see me. She only worked there 2 days a week, and I decided it was time to finally meet her boss after 6 years. Rachel and I have been married for 9 years. Although we were not rich, I made good money at the factory where I worked and preferred that my wife stay at home. But 2 years after we got married, she said that she needed to leave home and wanted to go into the job market. Since she also wanted to have her own car, she soon managed to convince me to let her work for a year or two. At least until she paid for the car she wanted to buy. So, a week after we agreed on her going back to work, she found a job at a pharmacy on the other side of town. A little over a year later, she gave birth to Sandy and then became a stay-at-home mom for the next 2 years. Later, as Sandy grew older, she again begged me to let her work, even if it was just a couple of days a week. She claimed she had already called the pharmacy where she previously worked and Mr. Clarkson was willing to take her back, even if it was just 2 days a week. I finally agreed, and she made arrangements with her mother so she could look after Sandy on the days she worked. She had been working 2 days a week for Mr. Clarkson for over 3 years, and Sandy was almost 6, and I had never stopped by her place of work. I parked in front of the pharmacy and Jim, and I went inside. It was a small place, but it had everything you would expect to find in a pharmacy. There were 4 long aisles, on both sides of which there were shelves filled with everything possible. And just behind there was a place where they write out prescriptions. Of course, Jim and I went there immediately. But instead of Rachel, as I expected, there was only a middle-aged man behind the long counter. He took Jim's recipe and started working from it. I was going to introduce myself and ask where my wife was, but since Jim was standing next to me, I didn't want him to know that I didn't know she wasn't there, so I didn't say anything. While the pharmacist was busy filling out the prescription, Jim walked slowly further, looking at the various display cases. That's when I decided to take a closer look at the back of the place. As I looked over the counter behind the pharmacist, my eyes fell on the table against the wall. On it was a framed photograph of a girl about 7 or 8 years old. What struck me about this photo was that the baby in it looked so much like my Sandy, it was creepy. She had the same long blonde hair and blue eyes. Even her smile was the same. I just stood there in awe, looking at the photo. I was shocked and amazed at the resemblance to my daughter. It was like I was looking at what Sandy would look like in a year or so. How is this possible? I asked myself. Suddenly, I couldn't help but ask the pharmacist, who was still busy counting pills, if the child in the photo was his daughter. No, I only have 2 boys at home. This is Katie. She is Mr. Clarkson's daughter. She's a wonderful child, isn't she? Yes, sure. I was simply too shocked to say anything, so I walked away, pretending to look for some item on the shelf to my left. But deep inside, I suddenly felt bad. I kept asking myself, how could this Katie look so much like my own daughter, and where was my wife? I had a very bad feeling at the time. Deep down, I guess, I had a hint of the answers to both questions, but I wasn't ready to admit it to myself. Suddenly, I felt an urgent need to get out of there. I walked up to Jim and told him that I would be waiting for him in the car. As I sat there waiting for Jim, I began to think. Sandy looked nothing like Rachel, and she definitely didn't have any of my facial features. Rachel and I had brown eyes and dark brown hair. Sandy was blonde. When she was a little child, All my friends joked about the color of her hair. Some even asked me how often I ordered pizza home or what color the mailman's hair was. Of course, these were just friendly jokes, and these remarks did not bother me. But now it all came back to haunt me. Was Sandy really my daughter, or was she Mr. Clarkson's daughter? The strange thing was that I had never met or seen Carl Clarkson, so I had no idea what he looked like, other than the fact that he had blonde hair. Rachel told me this several times. When Rachel and I returned home that evening, she noticed my quiet and thoughtful mood and even asked if anything was bothering me. Of course, I didn't tell her that I stopped by her work that day and what was on my mind. But of course, I would like to know where she was when I stopped there, but I kept silent about my doubts. I knew I had to be careful not to blame her for something that could only exist in my imagination. More importantly, I knew I needed evidence to confirm or refute my doubts about my daughter's parentage. You see, it was extremely painful for me to even think that my precious angel might not be my biological daughter. I loved my daughter more than anyone else in the world, and I would walk through fire for her. I tried to convince myself that maybe it was just a coincidence that the two girls looked so much alike, but deep down I felt a growing suspicion that kept coming to the surface. Later that evening, as I lay in bed next to my wife, I finally realized the full implications of the day's events. If Sandy wasn't my daughter, and if Carl Clarkson was her biological father, that meant Rachel had been sleeping with him from the very beginning, when she first started working for him over 6 years ago. I told myself that even today, it is more than likely that she is still carrying on her affair with her lover. Bitch, she must have been cuckolding me all these years. Even now, there was a good chance that she was still sleeping with him twice a week every time she was supposed to work at the pharmacy. As soon as her workday is over, and after she's been with him, she comes home to me with a happy smile on her face. Every time she comes back to my house after having sex with her boss, she probably secretly enjoys the knowledge that she just cuckolded me, knowing that I have no idea about her affair. Yes, I had already noticed that she always took a shower as soon as she got home, telling me, I need to get rid of the smell of the various chemicals that I come into contact with. Now I knew that she had rushed into the shower as soon as she got home to remove all traces of her recent infidelity. The next day was Friday, as Rachel didn't work that day. I drove to her work after dropping Jim off at his house. Now I wanted to see Carl Clarkson face to face. Since he didn't know me, and since I had never seen him before, I felt it was time to finally look at him. When I asked the woman behind the cash where Mr. Clarkson was, I was told that he had already gone home, but she added that Mr. Manning, his assistant, could help me with a prescription. She pointed to the back, and I realized that she was pointing to the same man who had written out the day before Jim recipe. I told her that I would return another day as I had personal matters with Mr. Clarkson. She then dropped a bombshell on me by adding that I should make sure I didn't come in on a Tuesday or Thursday afternoon, since he was never in the pharmacy at that time. Of course, I left without saying another word. I simply nodded to indicate that I understood. What the hell is going on here? I said to myself as soon as I got into the car. Rachel was hired to help Mr. Clarkson on those 2 days. She was here to count pills for him and help him fill prescriptions at home. She always called him Mr. Clarkson, and now I've just been told that on the 2 days a week she was at work, he had the afternoon off day. It just didn't make sense to me. What did Rachel do in those days? After all, she had to help her boss. She wasn't there the day before, but she had to work. Was she anywhere else with him? After Sandy was born, I was adamantly opposed to her returning to work, but she continued to insist until I finally relented. Now I had very bad feelings about her work, and the photograph of the child that was on the table kept coming back into my head and haunting me. In my mind, the wall of doubts about my wife's fidelity grew stronger. Was she cheating on me with her boss, or was it just my overactive mind playing tricks on me? That weekend at home with Rachel was the worst of my life. Every time I looked at her, I imagined her having sex with her boss. Of course, I couldn't identify his face because I didn't know what exactly he looked like. To make matters worse, I imagined them laughing and joking at me. I felt deep down that there was a good chance that Sandy was his daughter. Could she even work with him on her second child? All these years, she probably slept with him more often than with me. Now I couldn't think about her without feeling my anger come to the surface. I knew that from now on, every time I looked at her, I would feel the same disappointment until I had evidence to the contrary. On Saturday morning, while she was still sleeping next to me, I looked at her calmly. She truly was a beautiful woman. Her long brown hair was spread out on the pillow, and she looked so peaceful. As these thoughts and images of these two fucking unfolded in my overactive mind like the movie Triple X, it became incredibly difficult for me. At this, I became angry. The love I once had for her was melting like snow under the rays of the hot summer sun. As the days passed, I became more and more convinced that she slept with me and with her boss. Now I was also convinced that her affair with her boss had been going on for many years. The love I had always felt for her was almost gone, gradually replaced by a growing desire to take revenge on her and her lover. All my life I have always been a gentle and caring husband, and considered myself a good lover with my wife. One evening, as she sat quietly in front of me at the kitchen table, I watched her eat quietly. I could tell that she suspected that I knew something about her affair with Carl. She was probably afraid now to bring the matter into the open and talk frankly with me. Why was she afraid? I didn't know for sure because I've never been a violent person. Maybe she wasn't ready to end her marriage with me. She wanted to maintain the security of her marriage to me, as well as the excitement, or was it love of her affair with her boss? On Sunday afternoon, I came up with a plan to test her and finally tried to get proof of her cheating. I then decided that I would take the following Tuesday off and follow her to her place of work. I was pretty sure she and her lover weren't cheating at the pharmacy, so they had to go somewhere else to cuckold me. So I planned to ask Jim to lend me his truck that day so I could follow her undetected. On Tuesday morning, as usual, I put on my work clothes and followed him home. Once there, I gave him the key to my car and drove off in his truck. I drove back to my house, parking the truck just a few houses away so I could get a clear view of my house. Half an hour later, I saw Rachel get into the car with Sandy and quietly followed her to Sandy's school, where my daughter got out. Then she went straight to the pharmacy. I parked Jim's truck across the street and waited patiently, listening to the radio. I don't know exactly what I expected, but I just knew something was going to happen. From where I sat, I could see her red Toyota and most of the parking lot next to the pharmacy. I was determined to stay there all day if necessary. Just half an hour after she walked into the pharmacy, I saw a black SUV pull into the parking lot and the driver parked next to my wife's Toyota. A tall, well-dressed, blond man in his mid-30s got out of his car and entered the pharmacy, using the key to a private door that opened next to the parking lot. The moment I saw him get out of the car, I knew he was the father of the little girl I saw in the framed photo. It suddenly hit me. This man was also likely Sandy's biological father. The idiot was my wife's lover. He's the one who's been cuckolding me for the last 6 years. I felt a strong urge to run after him and beat the hell out of him, and then go inside and beat the crap out of my wife too. But the time for expressing my rage in that way had passed. I'm at least 6 years late. It would have been nice to do it even after she did it the first or second time. Then maybe, just maybe, there would have been a chance that my marriage could have survived her cheating, but not after 6 years of cheating with him in front of me. Any possibility, no. Now is the time to get rid of her, and also make them both pay for what they did to me. Payback was definitely on my mind now. I waited patiently in Jim's truck until noon. Suddenly, I saw that same door burst open and Rachel and that blonde asshole walked out of the building. They both had smiles on their faces, and to those who didn't know them, they looked like a happy couple. They both got into his SUV and drove away. The black SUV was easy to follow as my wife's lover seemed to be in no hurry. 15 minutes later, they were driving along a country road leading to the lake. Another 10 minutes, and I saw them turning towards the entrance to a beautiful log cabin right on the lake. I parked Jim's truck on the side of the road a half-mile further and then walked back to the log cabin. It was surrounded by a tall, well-trimmed cedar hedge, except on the side facing the lake. Thus, I knew that I had nothing to fear from neighbors watching, since the high hedge would provide me with enough privacy. I walked slowly around the house until I heard a noise coming from the open window on the left side of the cottage. Carefully approaching the floor-open window that reached up to my shoulders, I looked inside. Now I no longer had any doubt. Carl Clarkson was Sandy's biological father. All these years she made me believe that I was Sandy's father, and thus made me look like a fool. My wife and her lover must have laughed at me. In their eyes, I was the biggest cuckold there could be, since I was unknowingly raising another man's child. But I loved my daughter. In my mind, she was still my daughter, and always would be. No one was going to take her away from me. I had to move a couple of yards away from the window because I was afraid that the noise I made while vomiting would give away my presence. They rested like that for a long time. Then I heard them talking. They both laughed at me. The only thing that stopped me from storming into the bedroom and hurting them both was the promises I made to myself at that moment. I had to move away from the window for a while so as not to hear what they were saying about me anymore. By this point, I was crying and feeling sorry for myself. Of course, this further increased my anger towards both of them. At that moment, I regretted that I had not brought a camera with me and thus did not have access to evidence of her infidelity. By this point, I knew I was going to file for divorce. I needed to make a convincing case for her infidelity to the judge and try to get custody of Sandy. Seeing your wife, the woman you love, secretly having sex with another man is a devastating experience. I couldn't look at them or listen to what they were saying anymore, so I walked quietly back to the truck. That day, Rachel returned home at her usual time after work. She immediately went upstairs to take a shower while I prepared dinner for the family, as I usually did on days when she worked. We didn't talk much to each other, but we both paid a lot of attention to Sandy as she told us about her day at school. The next morning was Wednesday, and Rachel didn't work that day. She was wearing a dress and sitting at the table eating breakfast with me and Sandy. From time to time, I would catch her looking at me when she thought I was busy eating. There was a strange expression on her face. I guess she now strongly suspected that I knew something about her affair with her boss. I even caught a hint of fear in her gaze. That evening, as she was putting away the dishes in the kitchen, I told her about a fictional factory worker. Last week, he saw his wife as a different man. I told her that he beat her to a pulp when he found out about her affair. I also added that his friends at the factory were planning to teach their lover a lesson by beating the crap out of him. After quietly listening to what I said, she looked at me with wide eyes and then asked if I thought this was the right thing to do. I explained to her that a woman has no right to cheat on her husband. It would be fair that both of them, the wife and her lover, should pay for the disrespect shown to the husband's marriage. Tuesday, I took the day off again and borrowed Jim's truck again. After eating lunch in the truck at noon, I drove to the lake cottage, and sure enough, Carl's black SUV was parked in the driveway. This time I had a video camera with me and was ready to film evidence of their fraud. I needed this evidence not only to get custody of Sandy, but also to show it to Carla's wife. Yes, I intended to hurt him as much as I could. He was going to pay for the illicit sex he got from his affair with my wife. For a while, I seriously considered giving Sandy and I a DNA test, and then using that as proof of her infidelity. But then I realized that even if I proved that I was not Sandy's biological father, that fact would also give my wife a reason in court to take Sandy away from me. Instead, I decided to pretend I was unaware of this fact and hoped that a video of them having sex together would be enough. Now I have videotaped everything they did. As I took them off, I heard Carl tell my wife that he was making sure his wife never got a driver's license so she couldn't spy on him. Rachel later told him that I had been acting strange the last few days. She also added that she was now afraid that I might suspect the truth about their affair. I could also tell that this discovery made Carl very nervous. When I decided that I had enough footage of the cheating bitch and her lover, I went home to cook dinner, as I usually did every time she worked. She usually finishes work at 6 and comes home 15 minutes later. Now I knew that in those days she had to work. She and Carl must have met from 2:30 to 5:30 p.m. That evening, while preparing dinner for my soon-to-be disintegrating family, I decided that I was going to exploit the fear that they both seemed to have for me. I'm not a violent person, but I guess the story I came up with about a man working in a factory who beat his wife because she cheated on her really scared the crap out of her. I thought that now she was waiting for time for something to happen that would free her from me. She was probably looking forward to me filing the divorce papers so she could run away to her lover forever. On Wednesday of the same week, while we were having dinner, I started talking to her again about the man from work whose wife had cheated on her. I told her that he finally got revenge on the man who slept with his wife. I explained to her that the woman's lover was now in the hospital and in very serious condition. Of course, he only got what he deserved, I told her. Then, further fueling the fire of her fear, I added that the deceived husband was ready for both a divorce and custody of his children. I could tell Rachel was shocked to hear this. While she calmly continued to eat, I saw her hands trembling. When she returned home the next day after meeting her lover, she seemed nervous. I could see the fear in her eyes. Then, while we were having dinner, I started asking her questions about her work. Who exactly was her boss, what he looked like, how many children he had, and so on. Until that day, I had never shown any interest in him, so my questions about her boss made her feel bad and made me feel good. I even asked her what exactly she does at the pharmacy and how she works there. Then, to sow even more doubt and add fuel to her fear, I added that I might go and visit her at work one of these days. Now it was clear that she was clearly shocked, but she didn't say anything. She just looked at me with a strange expression and nodded slowly. That evening, I asked her if she had ever cheated on me. Of course, she immediately declared her complete devotion to me, but I felt her body trembling as she silently cried. I pretended not to notice anything. From then on, she never dared to refuse me anything in bed. Now I knew that she could tell that I had lost all the respect I once had for her. However, she never once complained about the way I treated her, although she must have realized that the love I once had for her had completely evaporated. That weekend, I invited her to eat with Sandy. We acted like a loving family, but even Sandy could tell that her mother had changed over the past couple of weeks. My daughter now always came to me with her questions and hugs, not to her mother. That evening at the restaurant, we had almost finished eating when Sandy went to the toilet. Since we were alone, I took the opportunity to ask Rachel if anything was bothering her and if she wanted to talk to me about it. You know what the problem is, Roger? I don't know what's come over you in the last couple of weeks, but you don't make love to me anymore. You're very rude. When was the last time you made love to me? I don't want you to tell me when was the last time you gave me your body. No, tell me when was the last time you actually made love to me. She was now looking at me with deep concern written all over her face. It was clear that she now felt a spark of remorse in her deceitful heart, but at the same time it was clear that it was not her intention to confess anything to me. Even if she admitted to cheating and asked for forgiveness, I definitely would not forgive her. It was too late for that now. What she did to our marriage, to me and to Sandy, was unforgivable. You know I love you, Roger, but the last couple of weeks I haven't seen love in your eyes. When you're with me, you insult me. Then I gave her a knockout blow. Tell me, Rachel, are you cheating on me? If so, then we as a couple are separated, and you will never see our daughter again. I can guarantee you that. I finally said it. The cat is already out of the bag. She looked at me for long seconds, too stunned to say anything, and even as we both looked at each other, I saw tears form in her eyes. Suddenly, she took her purse and ran out of the restaurant. I paid the bill and waited for Sandy to come out of the restroom. When we got to the car, Rachel was waiting for us. Her eyes were red, but she wasn't crying anymore. As soon as Sandy fell asleep that evening, I told my wife that if she ever cheated on me, I would get back at her and she would pay for it for the rest of her life. She cried but never answered. The following Monday, I went to my boss and asked for 2 weeks off. At first, he didn't want to give it to me, but when I explained that I was having a family crisis, he finally agreed. That same day, I went to Carl's house. I parked in front of his house and sat for long minutes, contemplating my next move. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but I decided it was time for me to meet his wife and tell her what the score was. I could see her in the backyard near the pool. She seemed taller than Rachel. She had light brown hair, the same as my wife. Finally, I found the courage to get out of the car and, opening the fence door, slowly walked into the backyard. As I got closer to her, I noticed that she was wearing beige shorts and a yellow tank top. She was an extremely beautiful woman with long legs and a figure that any woman would be proud of. She was busy moving chairs around the pool. As soon as I stood in front of her, I introduced myself. "I'm Roger from Weld. My wife Rachel works for your husband at the pharmacy." She looked at me strangely for a few seconds. Then a smile appeared on her lips as she shook my hand. "Yes, of course, I heard about Rachel. I've never met her, but my husband mentions her sometimes. I'm Claudine Clarkson." She smiled at me as we shook hands, and I could tell she had a pleasant personality. Then I realized that she knew nothing about her husband's affair with my wife. Of course, what I was going to tell her would be devastating, but there was no other choice. She needed to know the truth. So I decided it would be best if I got straight to the point. After all, I wasn't there for a social visit. "Mrs. Clarkson, what I am going to tell you will cause you a lot of pain, but you need to say it. I am afraid that your husband and my wife are cheating on us, and this has been going on for many years." She was silent for several seconds with her mouth slightly open, examining me carefully. Then I saw tears begin to form in the corners of her eyes. Standing motionless in front of me, she suddenly put both hands to her mouth in shock. But before I could continue with what I wanted to tell her, she finally asked me if I had proof of what I was saying. "Yes, I have evidence of their affair. I have pictures of them together at your lake cottage, and I'm afraid there's more to it than that. Their affair has been going on for more than 6 years, and what's worse is that I'm also sure that your husband is the biological father of my daughter." Suddenly, she started crying, and I had to help her get into the house. I sat her down on the couch and waited a few minutes until she calmed down a little. Sitting in front of her, I took out a photograph of my daughter from my wallet and handed it to her. "This is my daughter, Sandy. Do you see the striking resemblance to your husband? Look, she has the same blonde hair, the same thin nose and high cheekbones. She actually looks a lot like your own daughter." There was a photograph of her daughter on the mantelpiece. I stood up, picked her up, and placed both photos next to each other in front of her on the coffee table. "Look at the resemblance of Mrs. Clarkson. They could almost pass for twins. We don't need to do DNA tests to make sure they're related. Anyone can tell they're sisters." By this time, Claudine had stopped crying. She held both photographs in her hands and continued to look at them. Finally, she looked up at me and said in a desperate voice, "What do we do? I don't know about you, but I'm divorcing my wife and want custody of my daughter. Yes, I believe this is the only fair solution for you. I have been doubting for a long time that Carl is cheating on me. I will make him pay for what he did. You should hire a lawyer, Mrs. Clarkson. If you want, I will give you copies of the photographs I already have of them together. But we'll have to wait a couple of days before telling them that we know about their affair. I'll explain why." Then I went to my car to get the tape, and we watched part of it together. My wife had sex with her husband. Claudine cried a little more, and after a few minutes, she asked me to stop recording. When she calmed down a little, I began to explain to her what I was going to do. At my request, she finally agreed to wait a few days before telling her husband that she was leaving him. I spoke with my lawyer on Tuesday. He explained to me that even with the pictures I had of my cheating wife, it would be very difficult for me to get custody of Sandy, especially if I was not her biological father. He explained that all my wife had to do was run a DNA test on Sandy and prove that I was not her biological father. He also added that if she had made this argument in court, I could have sued Carl for all those years of child support. But I will still lose custody of Sandy. I, of course, didn't want that to happen, so I told him to stop everything for now. I had to find a way to get her to run away from home and leave Sandy with me. That's why I started formulating a plan to do just that. If I could force her to leave with her lover, even for a few days, she would lose custody of our daughter if we separated. After all, no DNA tests had yet been done to prove that I was not Sandy's father, and a mother who had an affair with another man would look very bad in the eyes of a judge. When Rachel came home from work, she looked like crap. My daughter was playing in the yard with her friends, and before Rachel could take a shower, I followed her into our bedroom. When she realized that I now knew her secret, she cried and begged me to forgive her. She tried to talk to me. She kept saying how sorry she was, but I just looked at her without saying a word. When she realized that I wouldn't talk to her, she finally told me that she was going to end her affair with Carl and quit her job. She even claimed that she only loved me, and if I was willing to forgive her, she would make amends. It was easy to see that she was lying. Hearing what she said about me while she was in the cottage with her lover, I realized that she was not going to leave him. No, she was just trying to buy time. It was clear that she had now decided to leave me for Carl, and the only thing stopping her from leaving immediately was Sandy and her fear of my immediate reaction. I knew that if I wanted to get her to run away with the boss, I would have to feed that fear. She had to fear for her safety as well as the safety of her lover. Therefore, I told her in a very calm voice that I would never forgive her for betraying me and that my revenge on her and Carl would also be very painful. Of course, I didn't say anything about not being Sandy's father. Later that day, I drove to Claudine's house. On my recommendation, she used the services of the same lawyer as me. She told me that he had already completed most of the paperwork for both divorces. She also said that her husband had been acting strangely for the past 24 hours. She saw him putting boxes in his SUV when he thought she was in the yard. She was pretty sure he was secretly planning to leave her. I let her know that this was the best thing that could happen to her, because if he did this, she would automatically get custody of her daughter. By leaving his family, he will lose everything. If it comes to that, he will look very bad in front of the judge. Naturally, Rachel didn't go to work that Tuesday. She told me that she quit her job and had no intention of ever speaking to Carl again. I didn't even give a feather to her promise. Firstly, I knew she was lying, and besides, I didn't intend to stay married to her for long. Later that day, I noticed that she had quietly packed her clothes from her closet, so I knew that she was also planning to leave me very soon. But I wasn't going to let her take Sandy with her. To increase her already strong desire to run away with her lover, I decided to continue to instill fear into her sick mind. When she asked me what my intentions were for our marriage, I simply told her that once I took care of her lover, I was going to decide what to do with her. I saw the fear in her eyes as she silently looked at me for long seconds. I still can't understand why she thought I could be cruel to her. In all the years we were together before I found out about her affair with her boss, I never once threatened to use violence against her. I am not a violent man by nature, and until the last 2 weeks I have always been very gentle with her, in bed and during our daily interactions. But once I discovered that she had broken her marriage vows over 6 years ago and continued to do so, the love I once had for her simply evaporated and I became a different man. Not a cruel person, but a sad and angry one. The next day I took Sandy to school and spoke with the woman in charge of her school. I explained to her that my wife was planning to run away with another man, and there was a high chance that she would try to kidnap my daughter. Under no circumstances was she allowed to allow my wife or anyone else to pick up my daughter from school. I explained to her that I would drive her to school every day and later pick her up at school where she would have to wait for me. Later in the day, I drove to Claudine's house. I knew that while I was out, my wife was going to use the phone and talk to Carl, but I was counting on it because I hoped that they would carry out their escape plan together. I wanted her out of my life, and I wanted him as far away from me as possible. I could no longer serve my cheating wife with divorce papers because there was a good chance she would take Sandy away from me. Instead, I intended to force her to run away with Carl and thus leave her daughter behind, even if it was only for a few days. I was going to move with my daughter to the other side of the country if she did it. Claudine was crying when I came to her house. She said Carl took most of his clothes from the house and left without telling her where he was going. Now I realized that he was waiting for me to leave the house to pick up Rachel, but I wanted to make sure they didn't take Sandy with them, so I immediately went to Sandy's school. As soon as I got there, I saw Carl's car driving in front of the school. He was with my wife. They both saw me park the car in front of the school, and as soon as they saw me, they drove away very quickly. My daughter was still at school, and I took her home with me. I later explained to Sandy that her mother would be away for a while because she had to visit a sick relative. The next day, I changed all the door locks and later went to my lawyer to tell him that Rachel had left her family and run off with her lover. After that, I went to a real estate agent to put my house on the market. I explained that I wanted the house to sell as quickly as possible. Since it was registered in my name, only I knew that there would be no problems with paperwork. That evening, I called Claudine. She was crying. She said that her husband left her a note on her bed in which he explained that he was leaving her because he had fallen in love with someone else. He also explained that he had spoken to his lawyer last week and the house and cottage were now in her name only, and he had also left a small amount of cash in the bank for her. I felt very sorry for her, and for some reason I felt a little responsible for what was happening to her. I then explained to her that my daughter Sandy missed having her mother in the house, and since I was going to order a large pizza and salad, I asked her to bring Katie and come eat with us. In less than 15 minutes, Claudine and Katie were at my house. I think inviting them to eat with us at our house was the best decision I've ever made. You see, my daughter and Katie got along very well, and Katie's presence filled some of the void left by her mother's absence. As for me, I found Claudine's company very revealing and comforting, and we all had a very pleasant evening. From there, things moved very quickly, and Claudine and I soon became very good friends. She sold her cottage and house, and a couple of weeks later, she moved in with me. We were now a good family, and to those who didn't know us, we were a married couple with 2 beautiful daughters. Once I found a buyer for my house, I explained to Claudine that we should move so our spouses wouldn't be able to find us if they tried. Less than a month after Rachel left me, I was living in Texas with Claudine and 2 girls. Over the years, I built a beautiful home in a mid-sized city and discovered that I could make a lot of money as a home contractor. This is exactly what I'm doing now. I even have 5 men working for me. Now it's been 5 years since Claudine and I moved to Texas. We had a baby boy last year, and everyone here thinks we're a happy married couple, and Fat Sandy and Katie are our 2 daughters. As for Rachel and Carl, we've never heard from them in all these years, and we both hope we never do. I guess by now they must have realized that scammers always pay the price. Ultimately, they each lost all contact with their daughter due to the affair. Life is very sweet for us now. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.